The day a junkyard received a $25 million offer, the people who laughed the hardest were suddenly the quietest. The conference room overlooked nearly 40 acres of rusted metal, abandoned equipment, broken machinery, and rows of vehicles that had not moved in years. Investors sat around a polished table studying photographs projected onto a large screen. Lawyers reviewed documents. Financial analysts compared valuation reports. Nobody in the room seemed interested in the junkyard itself anymore. They were interested in the man who owned it. One investor leaned back in his chair and asked the question everyone wanted answered. Who bought this place? The reply came immediately. A single dad named Ethan Brooks. Several people exchanged confused looks. The answer sounded wrong. Not impossible, just unexpected. Most fortunes began with corporations, investment groups, or wealthy entrepreneurs. This one apparently began with a man driving an aging pickup truck and raising an 8-year-old daughter alone. Across the table, another investor flipped through several pages of documentation. He bought the entire property 6 months ago? Yes. For that price? Yes. Silence followed. Outside the windows, sunlight reflected off endless rows of scrap metal. To most people, the property still looked worthless. The difference was that nobody in the room believed that anymore. The offer sitting on the table proved otherwise. $25 million. The number carried enough weight to make even experienced investors pay attention. One executive pointed toward an aerial photograph. What exactly did he find out there? Nobody answered immediately, not because the information was secret, because the full answer remained surprisingly difficult to explain. Some of the value came from overlooked industrial assets. Some came from rare equipment. Some came from opportunities hidden beneath years of neglect. Yet none of those explanations fully captured what had happened. The truth seemed simpler. Ethan Brooks had looked at the property differently than everyone else. Several hundred miles away, Ethan was completely unaware of the meeting taking place. He was standing beside a forklift in the middle of the same junkyard, reviewing inventory notes while his daughter Sophie followed him carrying a clipboard almost half her size. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across piles of metal and forgotten machinery. To Sophie, the place felt like an adventure. To everyone else, it had once looked like garbage. "Dad," Sophie asked while studying a row of rusted containers, "why do people keep wanting to visit now?" Ethan smiled slightly. "Because they finally started paying attention." Sophie nodded as though that answer made perfect sense. Maybe it did. Because 6 months earlier, almost nobody wanted anything to do with the property, including the CEO who had called it trash. And that was exactly where the story began. 6 months earlier, almost nobody wanted the property. The junkyard sat on the edge of town behind a chain-link fence covered with faded warning signs and climbing weeds. Rusted vehicles filled entire sections of the land. Broken machinery occupied others. Decades of discarded equipment created the impression that the place had long ago reached the end of its useful life. Most people drove past without giving it a second glance. Claire Montgomery certainly had. As chief executive of Montgomery Industrial Holdings, she viewed the property as a liability. It had belonged to one of the company's older acquisitions for years, quietly generating maintenance expenses while producing almost no meaningful return. During quarterly reviews, the junkyard appeared on financial reports for one reason only. It cost money. One Monday morning, Claire sat at the head of a conference table reviewing a proposal prepared by her asset management team. The recommendation was simple: sell the property, eliminate the expense, move on. "Any objections?" she asked. Nobody offered one. Several executives actually looked relieved. The junkyard had become one of those forgotten assets that everyone wished would disappear. "What is the estimated value?" Claire asked. An analyst checked his notes. "Not much. The land has some value. The scrap metal has limited value. Most of the equipment is considered obsolete." Claire nodded. Exactly what she expected. "List it." The decision took less than 30 seconds. Weeks passed. Potential buyers toured the property. Most never returned. Some submitted offers so low they were immediately rejected. Others lost interest after reviewing environmental reports and cleanup estimates. The consensus remained consistent. The property was more trouble than it was worth. Eventually, even the company's brokers began lowering expectations. One afternoon, Claire visited the site herself. She stepped carefully around cracked pavement while looking across acres of rusting metal. Wind pushed through empty structures. Old equipment sat motionless beneath years of dust and weather. The place looked abandoned by progress itself. One executive accompanying her gestured toward a collapsed storage area. "Honestly, we are lucky if somebody takes it off our hands." Claire agreed. Everything she saw supported the same conclusion. The junkyard represented the past, not the future. Meanwhile, on the opposite side of town, Ethan Brooks spent his afternoons repairing equipment at a small machinery service shop, while Sophie completed homework at a nearby desk. Their life was simple, predictable. Money remained tight but manageable. Most evenings ended with paperwork, dinner, and conversations about school. Yet Ethan possessed one habit that often confused people. He paid attention to things others ignored. Old maps, auction notices, property records, historical surveys, small details hidden in ordinary places. One evening, while reviewing local listings after Sophie went to bed, a familiar address caught his attention. The junkyard. He studied the information for several minutes. Then he opened another document, then another. By midnight, a thoughtful expression had settled across his face. For the first time, someone was looking at the property and seeing something completely different. Most people who knew Ethan Brooks would have called him careful. Some would have called him stubborn. Very few would have guessed that he was considering spending nearly every dollar he had on a property that most investors would not accept for free. For the next several days, he returned to the documents again and again. Property surveys, historical ownership records, equipment inventories, environmental assessments, old aerial photographs dating back decades. The deeper he looked, the more questions appeared. That alone interested him. Valuable opportunities rarely announced themselves openly. More often, they hid beneath assumptions. One Saturday morning, Ethan drove Sophie to a local diner before heading toward the property. She sat beside him in the aging pickup truck, watching farmland pass beyond the windows. "Where are we going?" she asked. Ethan glanced toward the road ahead. "To look at something." Sophie smiled. "That usually means trouble." Ethan laughed quietly. "Sometimes." When they arrived, the junkyard looked exactly as everyone described it. Rust, weeds, abandoned equipment, rows of forgotten machinery stretching toward the horizon. Sophie stared through the fence. "This is what you wanted to see?" Ethan nodded. "It is." She studied the property again. "Why?" Ethan parked the truck and stepped out without answering immediately. Instead, he walked toward the fence line and began observing. The land itself interested him more than the scrap. So did the placement of old structures, the age of certain equipment, the unusual concentration of industrial assets scattered throughout different sections of the property. Nothing seemed extraordinary at first glance. Yet something felt incomplete, as though everyone had stopped investigating long before reaching the final chapter. Over the following week, Ethan returned several more times. sometimes alone, sometimes with a notebook, sometimes carrying old maps he compared against the existing layout. Every visit revealed another small detail: an outdated utility corridor, storage areas that appeared larger than reported, equipment classifications that did not fully match inventory records. Individually, none of it seemed important. Together, they formed a pattern. Meanwhile, inside Montgomery Industrial Holdings, executives continued lowering expectations regarding the sale. Brokers struggled to generate interest. Potential buyers disappeared after preliminary reviews. One manager joked that the company might eventually have to pay somebody to take the property away. The comment earned several laughs around the conference table. Claire Montgomery smiled as well. The junkyard had become an easy target, a symbol of wasted resources and forgotten value. Then Ethan submitted an offer. The number was not large. In fact, several executives initially thought it must be a mistake. When Claire reviewed the paperwork, she noticed the buyer's background immediately. No investment fund, no corporate entity, no development company. Just a single father operating on limited resources. "He wants to buy this?" one executive asked. Claire looked at the application and shook her head slightly. Apparently, the room filled with quiet amusement. Nobody understood why he wanted the property. Nobody believed it would end well. And that was exactly what made Ethan even more interested. The sale closed 2 weeks later. Ethan Brooks signed the final documents in a small conference room while attorneys reviewed paperwork and administrative staff processed transfers. The entire transaction felt surprisingly ordinary considering how unusual it seemed to everyone else. When the last signature was complete, one representative looked at him and asked the question Ethan had been hearing for weeks. "What exactly do you plan to do with it?" Ethan smiled politely. "I'm going to take a closer look." The answer produced the same reaction it always did: confusion. Outside the building, Sophie waited in the pickup truck, finishing a worksheet from school. When Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, she looked up immediately. "So now it is ours?" Ethan nodded. "It is." Sophie stared out the windshield for a moment. "What do we do with a junkyard?" Ethan started the engine. "First, we learn what is actually there." The next morning, long before sunrise, Ethan unlocked the main gate for the first time as owner. The property felt different now. Not because anything had changed physically. The rust remained. The weeds remained. The rows of forgotten equipment remained. What changed was responsibility. Every acre now belonged to him. Most people would have seen a problem. Ethan saw unanswered questions. He spent the next several days walking the property section by section. He carried a notebook, a flashlight, and copies of old inventory records. Whenever something failed to match the documents, he wrote it down. Whenever he discovered equipment listed incorrectly, he made notes. The process was slow, deliberate, almost boring from the outside. Yet small inconsistencies continued appearing. Storage areas contained more material than reported. Equipment classifications seemed incomplete. Several sections of the property had barely been examined in years. One afternoon, Sophie followed him through a neglected corner of the yard, where old industrial containers sat beneath overgrown vegetation. "Nobody has been back here in forever," she said. Ethan looked around carefully. "That is usually when interesting things get missed." Sophie smiled. "You always say that." "Because it keeps being true." Meanwhile, news of the purchase spread throughout town. People discussed it at diners, repair shops, and hardware stores. Most reactions followed the same pattern: curiosity followed by skepticism. Some believed Ethan had made a terrible mistake. Others assumed he would eventually resell the land and absorb a loss. Even inside Montgomery Industrial Holdings, former managers occasionally joked about the single dad who bought the company's biggest headache. During one executive meeting, a manager mentioned hearing that Ethan was spending entire days searching through piles of scrap. Several people laughed. Claire Montgomery did not laugh quite as much as the others. Something about the situation continued bothering her. Rationally, she knew the company had made the correct decision. Every report supported it. Every valuation supported it. Yet the confidence Ethan displayed never seemed consistent with someone making a reckless purchase. Back at the property, Ethan stood beside an aging warehouse structure near the northern edge of the yard. According to official records, the building contained nothing important. According to the faded markings on its exterior walls, that might not be entirely true. For several seconds, he studied the structure quietly. Then he opened his notebook and wrote down another observation. The list was getting longer. Over the next month, the jokes became more frequent. Every time Ethan Brooks appeared at the property, somebody seemed ready with another prediction about how badly the investment would end. Some came from local business owners. Others came from former employees who had once managed sections of the yard. None of them understood why he continued spending so much time studying old records, opening forgotten storage areas, and cataloging equipment that everyone else considered worthless. To them, the answer was obvious. The junkyard was exactly what it looked like, a junkyard. One afternoon, Ethan stopped at a diner near the highway after spending several hours documenting inventory. As he waited for coffee, two men at a nearby table recognized him. "You are the guy who bought that scrapyard, right?" one asked. Ethan nodded. "I am." The man laughed. "Hope you got a good deal on rust." Several customers smiled. Ethan simply thanked the waitress and returned to reviewing notes. The reaction disappointed some people. They wanted an argument. Instead, they got silence. Later that evening, Sophie sat across from him at the kitchen table while he compared property maps with inventory reports. "People still think you made a mistake?" she asked. Ethan looked up from the paperwork. "Some do. Does that bother you?" He smiled slightly. "Not really." Sophie considered that answer. "Why not?" Ethan tapped one of the documents. "Because they are looking at what they expect to see." The next week brought another surprise. While examining records connected to the old warehouse near the northern boundary, Ethan discovered several references that did not appear in any modern inventory database. The documents were incomplete. Some pages were missing, others were damaged. Yet a pattern emerged. Certain equipment categories listed decades ago had never been fully reconciled with later records. Ethan spent hours tracing serial numbers, ownership transfers, and disposal reports. The more he investigated, the stranger the inconsistencies became. Meanwhile, Claire Montgomery received periodic updates from brokers monitoring local industrial property activity. During one briefing, a consultant mentioned that Ethan continued surveying the site personally, rather than preparing it for resale. "He still thinks there is something out there," the consultant said. Several executives exchanged amused looks. Claire glanced toward the report without commenting. Publicly, she remained confident the company had made the right decision. Privately, curiosity was beginning to replace certainty. Back at the property, Ethan unlocked another neglected storage structure one quiet Saturday morning. Dust filled the air as sunlight filtered through narrow gaps in the walls. Rows of aging equipment stood motionless beneath decades of accumulation. Most appeared forgotten. Some had not been touched in years. Sophie followed carefully behind him, carrying her clipboard. "Did you find something?" she asked. Ethan did not answer immediately. Instead, he studied a faded identification plate attached to one machine near the rear wall. Then he checked a number written inside his notebook. For the first time since purchasing the property, a small smile appeared. It was not excitement. It was recognition. Somewhere inside the mountain of overlooked assets surrounding them, the first real piece of the puzzle had finally appeared. The machine standing in the back of the warehouse did not look impressive. Dust covered most of its surface. Several panels showed signs of age. A casual observer would have walked past it without slowing down. Yet Ethan Brooks remained standing in front of it for nearly 10 minutes. The identification plate matched information he had found buried inside decades-old records. More importantly, it matched information that should not have existed according to the official inventory. Sophie watched him from nearby. "Is it important?" she asked. Ethan ran a hand across the faded metal surface. "Maybe," Sophie smiled. She had learned that maybe usually meant yes. Over the next several days, Ethan focused almost entirely on that section of the property. He reviewed ownership histories, manufacturing records, and archived industry publications. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. Years earlier, several pieces of specialized industrial equipment had been stored on the property during a corporate transition. Most were eventually documented and removed. A handful appeared to have been forgotten, not hidden, not lost intentionally, simply overlooked as businesses merged, records changed, and employees moved on. The machine inside the warehouse happened to be one of them. What made the discovery interesting was not its appearance. It was its rarity. Ethan contacted an independent equipment appraiser located 3 states away. The conversation lasted nearly an hour. At first, the appraiser sounded skeptical. Then, Ethan provided serial numbers and manufacturing information. The tone of the conversation changed immediately. "Are you sure those numbers are correct?" the appraiser asked. Ethan checked the plate again. "I am." A long pause followed. "If that equipment is complete, somebody is going to want it." Ethan thanked him and ended the call. He did not celebrate. He simply added another note to the growing stack of documents covering his desk. Meanwhile, rumors began spreading through local business circles. Someone heard that an appraiser had visited the junkyard. Someone else claimed rare industrial equipment had been discovered. The stories grew larger with every retelling. Most people dismissed them. Others became curious. One afternoon, a former executive from Montgomery Industrial Holdings called Claire Montgomery. "Have you heard what people are saying about the property?" Claire looked up from a report. "Which version?" "The latest one involves forgotten equipment worth real money." Claire smiled politely. "People have been inventing stories about that place for months." Yet, after ending the call, she found herself thinking about it longer than expected. Back at the property, the appraiser finally arrived. He spent nearly 4 hours examining equipment, comparing serial numbers, and reviewing documentation. Ethan stayed mostly silent throughout the process. When the inspection ended, the appraiser closed his notebook and looked across the warehouse. Most people would have sold this entire place without ever noticing. Ethan nodded. "That seems to happen a lot." The appraiser laughed quietly. Then he handed Ethan a preliminary valuation estimate. For the first time since buying the property, the discovery had a number attached to it. And that number was far larger than anyone expected. The preliminary valuation changed everything. Not because Ethan Brooks suddenly became wealthy. The equipment had not been sold yet. The money did not exist yet. What changed was perception. For months, people had viewed the junkyard as evidence of a bad decision. Now it was becoming evidence that they might have been wrong. The appraiser's report circulated quietly at first, then less quietly. Industrial collectors made inquiries. Equipment brokers requested information. A few specialized manufacturers reached out directly. None of them were interested in the scrap metal. They were interested in the overlooked assets hidden among it. Ethan responded to every inquiry the same way, patiently, carefully, without rushing. He had spent too much time studying the property to make decisions based on excitement. One afternoon, while reviewing inventory inside the old warehouse, he discovered another detail that had escaped previous records. Several pieces of equipment originally listed as incomplete were not incomplete at all. Their missing components had been stored separately in a neighboring structure, decades earlier. The documentation connecting them had simply disappeared during ownership transitions. Sophie followed him through the building carrying a flashlight. "Is that good?" she asked. Ethan looked at the serial numbers and nodded. "Better than good." "How good?" Ethan smiled. "Enough to keep looking." Sophie grinned. That answer was becoming her favorite. Across town, Claire Montgomery received a report she had not expected. One of her analysts entered her office carrying updated market information. "You should see this." Claire reviewed the documents carefully. The figures were significantly higher than anything discussed during the sale process. "These numbers are verified?" she asked. "Multiple sources." Claire leaned back in her chair. For several seconds, she said nothing. Rationally, she understood that nobody could predict every opportunity. Businesses made decisions using available information. Yet the situation continued bothering her. Not because the property was becoming valuable, because Ethan had somehow recognized the possibility long before anyone else. Meanwhile, attention surrounding the junkyard continued growing. Local newspapers published short articles. Business forums discussed the unusual discovery. Former critics became curious observers. Some even visited the property hoping to understand what Ethan had seen. Most left disappointed. The junkyard still looked like a junkyard. Rusted equipment still filled the landscape. Aging warehouses still stood beneath weathered roofs. The treasure remained invisible to anyone looking only at the surface. Late one evening, Ethan sat alone reviewing another collection of historical records. The property maps covered most of the table. Notes filled the margins. Patterns connected places that seemed unrelated. Then he noticed something, a reference buried inside an old industrial survey. It pointed toward a section of the property that had received almost no attention. Ethan studied the document for several minutes. Then he reached for his notebook and added another entry. Outside, the junkyard remained quiet beneath the evening sky. Inside, the next piece of the puzzle had just revealed itself. And this one appeared larger than anything discovered so far. The section identified in the old survey sat near the western edge of the property, hidden behind rows of deteriorating storage containers and equipment that had not moved in decades. According to modern records, the area contained nothing significant. According to the forgotten document Ethan discovered, that assumption might be wrong. Early the next morning, he arrived with Sophie, several copies of historical maps, and enough determination to spend the entire day searching if necessary. The area looked exactly like the rest of the junkyard. Rusted structures, overgrown pathways, aging materials slowly disappearing beneath years of neglect. Nothing about it suggested opportunity. That was becoming a familiar pattern. Sophie examined one of the maps while Ethan compared landmarks. "Are we looking for something specific?" she asked. Ethan studied the faded survey carefully. "Not exactly." "Then how will we know when we find it?" A small smile appeared. "Because the paperwork and reality will finally match." For hours, they worked through old records and physical inspections. Most discoveries appeared minor. A mislabeled storage section, equipment positioned differently than documented, historical utility markings. Individually, none seemed important. Together, they continued reinforcing the same idea. Large portions of the property had not been properly evaluated in years. Then, shortly after noon, Ethan noticed something unusual. One structure appeared significantly larger than official dimensions suggested. The discrepancy was small enough to ignore unless someone happened to be comparing multiple generations of property records. Ethan happened to be doing exactly that. He spent the next several hours verifying measurements, reviewing construction diagrams, and tracing ownership documentation. The deeper he looked, the clearer the answer became. The original structure had been modified decades earlier. The modification appeared in older records but vanished from later inventories. Nobody had intentionally hidden it. The information had simply disappeared during administrative transitions. Sophie watched him review the documents for the third time. "You found something again, did you not?" Ethan nodded. "I think so." By the end of the week, independent inspectors and valuation specialists were walking sections of the property that nobody had examined seriously in years. Their findings surprised everyone involved. Assets previously classified as obsolete retained significant market demand. Storage areas contained equipment with specialized value. Historical industrial infrastructure created development opportunities that had never been included in previous assessments. Each new report increased the property's estimated worth. Meanwhile, news reached Montgomery Industrial Holdings. During an executive briefing, Claire Montgomery reviewed the latest numbers in complete silence. Several managers did the same. Nobody laughed anymore. The jokes had disappeared weeks earlier. The figures now appearing in front of them made joking impossible. One executive finally spoke. "We missed all of this?" Claire looked at the reports. Apparently. Across town, Ethan remained focused on the same routine he followed from the beginning. Research, verification, patience. Late one afternoon, while Sophie organized paperwork inside the office trailer, a black SUV pulled through the main gate. Two investors stepped out carrying folders. They were not there to buy scrap metal. They were not there to inspect equipment. They were there because they wanted to discuss purchasing the entire property. For the first time, the opportunity everyone dismissed was attracting exactly the kind of attention Ethan expected all along. 6 months after purchasing the property, Ethan Brooks found himself sitting across from investors discussing an offer worth $25 million. The number would have sounded impossible to most people who remembered the day he bought the Junkyard. Yet nobody in the room was laughing now. Detailed reports covered the conference table. Valuation studies, asset inventories, development projections, market analyses. Every document pointed toward the same conclusion. The property everyone dismissed had become one of the most valuable industrial opportunities in the region. One investor slid the final proposal across the table. "We are prepared to move immediately." Ethan reviewed the pages calmly. The room remained silent while executives waited for his reaction. Finally, he closed the folder. "I will think about it." Several people looked surprised. Most expected immediate excitement. Ethan simply thanked them for their time and left. Outside, Sophie waited beside the pickup truck. "Was it a good meeting?" she asked. Ethan smiled. "It was interesting." "That means yes." He laughed softly and started the engine. News of the offer spread quickly. Local newspapers published articles. Business groups discussed the story. The same people who once called the property worthless now described it as a remarkable opportunity. The transformation seemed sudden to outsiders. Ethan knew better. Nothing about it had happened suddenly. It came from months of observation, research, patience, and refusing to accept assumptions simply because everyone else accepted them. A few days later, Claire Montgomery requested a meeting. This time she visited the property herself. Together, they walked slowly through sections of the yard that had once been ignored. The afternoon sun reflected off restored equipment and organized work areas. Claire looked around quietly. "I have been trying to understand something," she finally said. Ethan waited. "What did you see that everyone else missed?" For a moment, he studied the rows of equipment stretching into the distance. "Nothing." Claire looked confused. Ethan smiled slightly. "I just kept looking after everyone else stopped." The answer stayed with her. It explained more than any financial report ever could. Before leaving, Claire shook his hand. There was no embarrassment, no resentment, only respect. As evening settled across the property, Sophie sat beside her father on the tailgate of the old pickup truck. They watched the sky turn orange above the rows of machinery that had changed their lives. "Did everybody really think this place was junk?" she asked. Ethan looked across the property one last time. "Most of them did." Sophie smiled. "Good thing you did not." Ethan nodded. Around them, the junkyard no longer looked forgotten. Yet the greatest victory was not the money, the investors, or the headlines. It was something much simpler. A quiet man had trusted his judgment when nobody else did. And in the end, the value he discovered was not hidden in the property. It was hidden in the ability to see what others never bothered to notice.